He stood up in front of $12 million worth of investors, clicked to the slide with my app's logo on it, and said the words, "my idea," with a straight face, like he hadn't spent the last 8 months forwarding me his own confused questions about how the back end even worked. I was sitting in the back row of that conference room in a blazer I'd borrowed from my roommate, badge around my neck reading guest, watching my own life's work get narrated back to a room full of strangers by someone who couldn't tell you what an API was if his inheritance depended on it. I'm Reese. And by the end of that meeting, one investor was going to ask a question that changed absolutely everything. I should tell you where the idea actually came from, because it matters, and because my brother's version of this story, the version he told 12 investors, 3 journalists, and, if I'm honest, our own mother, leaves this part out entirely. It came from a laundromat. Specifically, from standing in a laundromat at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, watching 4 separate people, myself included, wait in line for a single working dryer while 3 other machines sat broken with handwritten out-of-order signs taped to them, no indication anywhere of when they'd be fixed or whether the owner even knew they were down. I remember standing there, half asleep, doing mental math about how much time I'd lost that month waiting for machines that didn't exist versus machines that did, and thinking, someone should build something that tells you, in real time, which machines in a laundromat are actually working, before you drag your laundry 3 blocks for nothing. That night, I built the first rough version of what would eventually become Spindle, a simple app, ugly as sin in its first iteration, that let laundromat owners tag machines as working or broken in real time, and let customers check before they left the house. I coded the back end myself, badly at first, using tutorials and stubbornness and an embarrassing number of late nights, because I'd taught myself to code 3 years earlier out of pure spite after a boss told me, in an annual review, that I wasn't technical enough to move into the department I actually wanted. I am, for context, a software engineer. Have been for 2 years, at a mid-sized company that makes inventory management tools nobody outside of warehouse logistics has ever heard of. I did not come to this idea as an amateur. I came to it as someone who understood exactly how to build it, which is precisely why what happened next still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it, even now, months later. My brother Grant is not a software engineer. My brother Grant has never, to my knowledge, written a single line of code in his entire life. My brother Grant is, however, extremely good at talking, extremely comfortable in a room full of strangers with money, and extremely, historically, the golden child of our family in a way that has shaped basically every dynamic between us since we were children, a dynamic I understood intuitively long before I ever had the language to name it. I want to be fair to Grant here, or at least fair to the version of events that led up to the betrayal, because it didn't start as a betrayal. It started, honestly, as me being excited and a little naive. About 4 months after I built the first working version of Spindle, by then it had actual users, 3 laundromats in my neighborhood who'd agreed to pilot it, real data showing people were checking the app before leaving their apartments, small but genuinely encouraging numbers. I made the mistake of mentioning it at a family dinner, mostly because I was proud of it and wanted someone to be proud of me too. Grant lit up immediately. Grant, who works in sales for a mid-size furniture company and has always talked about wanting to build something of his own the way some people talk about wanting to run a marathon, someday, eventually, in a hypothetical future that never quite arrives, Grant leaned across the table and said, "Reese, this is actually genius. You have to let me help you pitch this. I know people. I could get us in front of real investors." I should have said no. I want to be honest about that, sitting here now, with the full benefit of hindsight, some part of me, even then, felt a small flicker of unease, a voice that said you built this alone, you don't need him. But I'd also spent 2 years watching Spindle stall out at 3 pilot locations because I genuinely did not know how to get in front of investors, didn't have the network, didn't have the confidence to walk into a room and talk about my own work the way Grant apparently could talk about anything, including things he barely understood. So I said yes. We agreed, verbally, over pie, no contract, no paperwork, a mistake I will regret for the rest of my professional life, that Grant would help with pitching and networking, that I would remain the technical lead and, we both agreed at the time, the actual founder, and that we'd figure out equity splits properly once we had real investor interest to justify the conversation. I built. He talked. For 4 months, that division of labor seemed to work exactly the way we'd agreed, and I was, honestly, grateful for it. Looking back, I can see the moment things started to shift, though at the time it felt too small to name, the kind of small erosion that only becomes visible in the aggregate, months later, once you finally step back and look at the whole eroded coastline instead of the single wave that took it. It started with pronouns. Grant would come back from a coffee meeting with some angel investor and say, I told them about our app, which felt fine, generous even, inclusive. Then it became, I told them about the app I'm building, which I noticed but let slide, because correcting your own brother over a pronoun felt petty, felt like the kind of thing you'd get told you were being too sensitive about at the next family dinner. Then it became emails. Grant started CCing me on investor correspondence less and less, to keep things simple, he said, so we're not overwhelming them with too many voices. Then it became meetings I wasn't invited to at all, because it's just a casual coffee, not worth your time, which felt, in the moment, like consideration rather than exclusion, framed always as him protecting my schedule rather than narrowing my access. By month 6, Grant had a pitch deck. I hadn't made it. I'd never seen it before he showed it to me, proudly, over dinner, expecting praise. It had my screenshots in it, my user data, my product roadmap, all things I'd shared with him for exactly this purpose, but the founder bio slide, the one at the very front, had a single headshot on it. His. Where's my slide? I asked, my voice coming out flatter than I intended. Oh, we can add you as a co-founder slide, obviously, he said, waving a hand like it was a minor formatting oversight, an easy fix for later. I just wanted the deck to have one clear face at the front, you know, for pitch clarity. Investors like a single clear narrative, apparently, that's just how these things work. I let it go. I want to sit with how much I let go, across those months, because I think it matters for understanding how something this large managed to happen right under my nose, one small concession at a time, each one individually reasonable sounding enough that objecting felt disproportionate, until suddenly they added up to something I could no longer recognize as the arrangement I'd originally agreed to. I think part of why I let it go traces back further than those months, honestly, back to a specific dinner table dynamic that had shaped both of us since we were kids. Growing up, Grant was the one who came home from school with a story about how he'd charmed a substitute teacher into extending recess, and our parents would laugh for 10 minutes about it at dinner. I was the one who came home with a straight-A report card and a science fair ribbon, and I'd get it "that's wonderful, sweetheart" before the conversation drifted, within about 90 seconds, back to whatever Grant had done that week that was more entertaining to discuss. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was just a family gravity, an unconscious weighting system that rewarded charisma over competence every single time the two collided at the same table, and both Grant and I had absorbed that weighting system so thoroughly, so early, that neither of us ever really had to discuss it out loud. We both just knew, instinctively, which currency our family valued more, and which one of us had been quietly minting it since childhood. So when Grant offered to handle the pitching, some old, well-worn groove in me simply accepted that this was, naturally, the correct division of labor, that my job was to be good at the actual thing, and his job was to be believed. I didn't examine that assumption nearly closely enough until it had already cost me most of a year. "He's cutting you out," my best friend Tasha said, the first time I described the pitch deck situation to her over drinks, months before the investor meeting that would eventually blow the whole thing open. "Reese, I love you, but you're describing a man slowly editing you out of your own company, one slide at a time, and you're describing it like it's a minor scheduling issue." Tasha and I met in college, in a computer science program where we were, for 2 straight years, the only 2 women in most of our upper-level classes, a shared experience that bonds you to a person in ways casual friendships never quite manage. She works in product management now, at a much larger company than mine, and has an instinct for organizational politics, who's quietly consolidating power, who's about to get pushed out of a project that has saved her career more than once and that she was now, clearly, trying to apply to mine. "He's not cutting me out. He's just handling the investor-facing stuff." That was the deal. Was it? Because from what you're telling me, the deal was you build, he pitches, you're both founders, equity split later. What I'm hearing now is you build, he pitches, and somehow only his face is on the deck, and somehow you're not in the meetings anymore, and somehow the equity conversation keeps getting pushed to some vague future date that never arrives. Reese, that's not a minor drift from the original plan. That's a completely different plan, executed slowly enough that you haven't noticed the switch yet. I didn't want to believe her, mostly because believing her meant confronting something about my own family that I'd spent 30 years avoiding, the deep, foundational imbalance in how my parents had always treated Grant's ambitions versus mine, the small ways I'd learned, as a kid, that his competence got rewarded with attention and my competence got rewarded with, at best, a nod and a "that's nice, honey," before the conversation moved back to whatever Grant was up to that week. "I'll talk to him," I said. "I'll get it in writing. An actual agreement." "Good," Tasha said. "Do it this week. Not next month. This week." I didn't do it that week. I did it 3 weeks later, after another investor coffee I found out about secondhand, scrolling past a LinkedIn comment that mentioned it, and by then, as it turned out, I was already too late for the version of this conversation that might have actually changed anything. I sat Grant down at his apartment, on a Sunday, with a printed document I'd drafted myself, a basic founder's agreement, equity split, roles clearly defined, IP assignment clauses I'd researched late into 3 separate nights because apparently my engineering degree hadn't covered how to protect yourself legally from your own sibling. "I want this signed," I told him, sliding it across his coffee table. 50-50 equity, both our names on every pitch deck, both of us in every investor meeting from here forward. I should have asked for this months ago. I'm asking now. Grant looked at the document for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, some mask slipping just slightly before he recovered it. "Reese, come on. This feels really formal for family. We don't need paperwork between us. We built a company together, Grant. Companies need paperwork. That's not a family issue, that's just how businesses work, and you know that. I just think it's a little insulting, honestly, that you'd want a legal document between us like we're strangers. Like I'm going to screw you over or something." He said it with a wounded tone, an expert deployment of hurt feelings that I recognized, even in the moment, as a technique, a redirection of the conversation from "is this fair" to "why don't you trust me?" A much harder question to answer honestly without sounding paranoid or cruel. "I don't think you're going to screw me over," I said, though even as I said it, some small, honest part of me wasn't fully sure that was true anymore. I think it's just smart. Please, Grant. Just sign it. Let me look it over properly. I want to run it by someone, make sure it's fair to both of us, not just written from your side. He folded the document and set it aside, and I left that Sunday afternoon telling myself I'd made progress, that a signature was coming, that I'd been reasonable and clear and he'd heard me. I never saw that document again. He never signed it. And 3 weeks later, I found out, through a LinkedIn post I stumbled across by accident, that Grant had a meeting scheduled with a serious venture capital firm, the kind of firm that funds companies at scale, not just angel round coffee chats, and I hadn't been told about it at all. I want to be honest about how I ended up in that conference room, because it wasn't graceful, and it wasn't confident, and it wasn't the triumphant moment you might picture from a story like this. It was me, at 11 o'clock the night before, Googling the venture capital firm's address, finding out the meeting was open to guests in the lobby per their front desk policy, and deciding, with a knot of anxiety sitting hard in my stomach, that I was going to walk in and sit in the back row whether Grant had invited me or not. I borrowed a blazer from Tasha, my roommate at the time, because I owned exactly nothing that looked appropriately professional for a room full of investors, and I signed in at the front desk under my own name, badge printed simply guest, no company affiliation listed, because I genuinely wasn't sure, at that point, what my own official relationship to my own company even was anymore. The conference room was glass-walled, sleek, intimidating in the specific way rooms designed to make founders feel small are intimidating. 12 chairs around a long table, 3 of them occupied by partners from the firm, the rest by associates taking notes on laptops. A wall of framed magazine covers lined the hallway outside, past companies the firm had funded that had gone on to become household names, a not-so-subtle reminder to every founder who walked past it of exactly what kind of outcome was theoretically possible in that building, and exactly how much smaller most pitches, by comparison, were destined to feel once they actually reached that room. I remember sitting in the lobby beforehand, watching a handful of other founders wait for their own meetings in adjacent conference rooms, all of them running through notes on their phones, one man visibly rehearsing his opening line under his breath, a woman beside him doing a strange, controlled breathing exercise that I recognized immediately because I'd done a version of it myself, alone in my car, before every single investor coffee Grant hadn't invited me to. It struck me, sitting there in a lobby full of strangers preparing for their own version of exactly this moment, how much of the startup world runs on precisely this kind of quiet, private terror, dressed up afterward, in every published success story, as effortless confidence. Grant stood at the front, in a suit I didn't recognize, clicking through a deck that had grown considerably slicker since the version he'd shown me over dinner months earlier, complete with custom illustrations I certainly hadn't commissioned and had no idea he'd paid for, a level of polish that made the whole presentation feel, at first glance, entirely legitimate, entirely his. I sat in the back row, behind a half-wall of glass that separated the guest seating from the main table, and watched my brother present my idea to a room of strangers with an ease that, under different circumstances, I might have admired. He'd clearly worked with a presentation coach, or watched enough pitch videos online to absorb the cadence of one, the deliberate pauses, the practiced hand gestures, the way he made eye contact with each partner in turn as though he'd rehearsed exactly how long to hold each gaze before moving on. It was, I realized watching him, an entirely different skill than the one I had, and for one brief, treacherous moment, sitting there in my borrowed blazer, I actually found myself wondering whether maybe this arrangement made a kind of sense after all, whether maybe the version of the story where I built quietly and he sold loudly really was the fairest division of labor, whether my discomfort was really just jealousy dressed up as principle. Then he got to the founder slide. "I'm Grant Doyle," he said, gesturing to his own headshot, "and I'm the founder of Spindle." No mention of me. No mention of a technical co-founder, no acknowledgement that the product he was describing in such confident, fluent detail had been built, line by line, by someone who wasn't in that room's official capacity at all, someone sitting in the back row in a borrowed blazer, watching her own life get erased in real time by someone who couldn't have explained the app's database architecture if his life depended on it. Whatever small, treacherous doubt I'd let myself entertain 30 seconds earlier evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, clean certainty that had been building in me, unacknowledged, for months. Grant was good, I'll give him that. He walked through the product, the pilot data, the growth numbers, my growth numbers, from my pilot laundromats, gathered from a database I'd designed and populated myself, with the fluent confidence of someone who had clearly rehearsed this pitch dozens of times, who understood, instinctively, how to read a room and adjust his energy to match whatever each partner seemed to respond to. It was going well. I could feel it going well, sitting in that back row, feeling sicker with every slide, because the thing about watching your own idea succeed in someone else's hands is that you can't even fully hate the outcome, only the theft. Then one of the partners, a woman named Odette Reyes, whose name I only learned later, whose reputation in the startup world, I would come to find out, was for asking exactly one uncomfortable question in every pitch meeting she sat in on, a question specifically designed to reveal whether a founder actually understood their own product or was simply performing understanding, leaned forward. "This is a compelling pitch," she said. "But I want to ask something specific, and I want you to be honest with me, because we're about to consider writing a significant check, and I need to understand exactly who's behind the technical execution here. Your deck mentions a proprietary real-time tagging algorithm that flags machine downtime patterns before owners self-report them. Walk me through how that actually works. Not the business case. The technical mechanism." The room went very quiet. I watched Grant's face, from the back row, through a half-wall of glass, but close enough to see it clearly, do something I'd genuinely never seen it do before in any high-stakes moment of his entire charismatic life. It froze. So that's handled by our technical team," he said, after a pause that lasted just slightly too long to be comfortable. "The specific implementation details, I can have someone follow up with a more technical breakdown after this meeting, if that would be helpful. I don't want to bore the room with back-end specifics right now." "I'd actually like to hear it now," Odette said, not unkindly, but with the specific patience of someone who has caught exactly this evasion 100 times before and knows precisely how it usually resolves. "Who's your technical co-founder?" "I don't see them listed on this deck at all, which is unusual for a product this technically sophisticated. Is there someone else we should be meeting?" I don't fully remember deciding to stand up. I remember the sensation of it more than the decision, my legs moving before my brain had finished processing what I was about to do, my chair scraping back loud enough that half the room turned to look at the source of the noise, my own voice arriving before I'd consciously chosen the words. "I built it," I said. "I'm the technical co-founder. I built the entire back-end, the tagging algorithm you're asking about, the pilot rollout, all of it. I'm Reese Doyle, Grant's sister." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably 4 seconds, 5 at most. Grant turned around fully, and I watched something complicated move across his face, not quite panic, not quite anger, something closer to the specific, cornered look of a person watching a carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time in front of exactly the audience he'd built it for. Odette Reyes looked at me for a long moment, then looked at Grant, then back at me, and something in her expression, sharp, assessing, entirely unfold, told me she'd already begun recalculating everything she'd just heard in the last 20 minutes. "Come sit down," she said to me, gesturing to an empty chair at the actual table, not the guest section behind the glass. "I have some questions for the real founder, if you don't mind." I walked from the back row to that empty seat on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own, aware of every eye in the room, aware of Grant standing frozen at the front with his slide clicker still in one hand, and sat down across from Odette Reyes with my heart hammering so hard I was half convinced the microphone on the table could pick it up. "Walk me through the tagging algorithm," she said. "In your own words. Take your time." And for the first time in 8 months, I got to talk about my own idea, in my own words, to the exact room it had always deserved to be presented to. I talked for nearly 20 minutes straight, and somewhere around minute 3, the shaking in my hands stopped, because I realized, with a kind of settling clarity, that I actually knew everything I was talking about, completely, in a way Grant simply never could have, no matter how many times he'd rehearsed a summary of my own work. I explained the tagging algorithm properly, how it cross-referenced usage patterns against owner-reported downtime to flag machines that were likely broken before an owner had even noticed. A detailed Grant's version of the pitch had flattened into a vague, impressive-sounding phrase without any actual mechanism behind it. I explained the pilot rollout, the specific laundromats, the actual conversations I'd had with actual owners about what features they needed and which ones they didn't care about at all, how one owner in particular, a woman named Corinne who ran a laundromat 3 blocks from my apartment, had told me flatly, in the second month of the pilot, that she didn't care one bit about fancy predictive analytics. She just wanted a button she could press with wet hands that wouldn't make her type A paragraph, a piece of feedback that had completely reshaped the entire interface and that Grant, in his version of the pitch, had never once mentioned because he'd never actually spoken to Corinne, or to any owner, in his life. I pulled up, on my own phone, screenshots of the actual codebase, commit histories with my name on every single one going back 14 months, dated and timestamped in a way no story Grant could tell would ever be able to argue with. One of the associates at the table, a younger man who'd been quiet for most of the meeting, leaned forward at one point and asked whether the tagging algorithm could theoretically be adapted for other shared equipment contexts, gym equipment, for instance, or shared office printers, and I found myself answering instantly, without hesitation, sketching out on a borrowed notepad exactly how the underlying architecture would need to change, what would stay the same, where the genuine technical challenges would live. It was the kind of question that either exposes a founder who's memorized talking points or reveals one who actually understands the bones of what they built, and I watched, with a small, private satisfaction, Odette Reyes nod slightly at my answer, making a note. Odette listened to all of it without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally glancing at the 2 other partners at the table, who were doing the same. When I finished, she set her pen down. "This is a very different pitch than the one I just heard," she said. "Not because the product is different. Because the person explaining it actually understands what she built, rather than performing an understanding of something she memorized. That's not a small distinction, Ms. Doyle. That's often the entire difference between a company that survives its first hard technical problem and one that doesn't." She turned to Grant, who was still standing near the projector screen, his slide clicker forgotten in one hand. "I want to be direct with you," she said, her tone shifting into something crisper, more clinical. "We fund founders, not frontmen. If your sister built this product and you presented yourself as its sole founder in a room full of investors considering a serious check, that's not a minor omission. That's the kind of misrepresentation that, frankly, makes me deeply reluctant to trust anything else in this deck, including the financial projections." The room went quiet again, and I watched my brother's face, still frozen at the front, finally crack into something closer to genuine fear, not fear of the investors, I think, not really, but fear of the version of himself now sitting exposed in front of a room full of strangers, a version he'd apparently believed, on some level, he could keep hidden indefinitely. Grant didn't say a single word to me for the rest of the meeting, which wrapped up shortly afterward with Odette telling both of us, carefully, that the firm would need to reassess internally before any further conversation, a diplomatic way of saying the deal, as pitched, was dead, though something new might yet be built from its wreckage. We walked to the parking garage together in silence, the kind of silence that has actual weight to it, pressing down on both our shoulders, neither of us willing to be the first to speak. "You humiliated me in there," he finally said, once we were alone between two parked cars, his voice tight with an anger that, even then, some part of me recognized as misdirected, anger at being caught, dressed up as anger at being wronged. "You stole my company, Grant." My voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "For 8 months. In front of investors. In front of our own family, honestly, because you let Mom and Dad believe this whole time that this was your idea, didn't you? Every time they asked about your app, you just let it stand. It wasn't stealing. I was helping you pitch it. That was always the plan, you agreed to that plan, the plan was both our names on the deck. The plan was both of us in every meeting. The plan was a signed agreement, which you never signed, Grant, which you took home and never returned to me, which conveniently disappeared right around the same time you stopped inviting me to meetings entirely. That's not helping. That's erasing me, slowly enough that I wouldn't notice until it was too late to fix quietly. He didn't have an answer for that, not a real one, just a long exhale and a hand dragged down his face, the posture of a man who knows, on some level, that he's out of good arguments even if he isn't ready to admit it out loud yet. "What happens now?" he finally asked, quieter. "I don't know," I told him honestly. "But it's not going to be whatever version of this you were building without me in the room." I called Tasha from my car before I'd even pulled out of the parking garage, and she picked up on the first ring, as though she'd been sitting by the phone specifically waiting for this exact call. "Tell me everything. From the top. Don't skip the part where you stood up." I told her everything, and by the end of it, she was laughing and crying at the same time in a way that made me start doing the same thing, both of us a mess on the phone in a parking garage and a kitchen 40 minutes apart. "Reese. You stood up in a room full of investors and reclaimed your own company. Do you understand how many people never get to do that? Do you understand how many women in tech watch exactly this happen to them and never get a room full of strangers who actually ask the right question at the right moment? I got lucky. If Odette hadn't asked that specific question, you didn't get lucky, Reese. You built something real enough that the cracks in the fake version were always going to show eventually. Odette just happened to be the one paying close enough attention to notice them first. That's not luck. That's what happens when you build something with an actual foundation instead of just a good story on top of nothing." I told my mother that same evening, sitting at her kitchen table, and her reaction surprised me more than almost anything else in the entire saga. I'd braced myself for defensiveness on Grant's behalf, for some version of the deflection I'd grown up watching her deploy every time Grant's behavior needed smoothing over. Instead, she went very quiet, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank from, and said, eventually, "I think I've known, on some level, for a long time, that we treated the two of you differently. I told myself it was because Grant needed more encouragement, that you were naturally competent enough not to need it. I think that was a story I told myself so I wouldn't have to examine what it actually looked like from where you were standing." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry, Reese. I should have asked more questions about all of this months ago, instead of just being proud of your brother for finally building something of his own. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo 30 years of a particular family dynamic in a single kitchen table conversation. But it was real, and it was more than I'd expected, and it mattered more than I let myself admit out loud that night. My father, for his part, took longer to come around, in the specific, quieter way I've come to expect from him, not through a single conversation, but through a series of small gestures over the following weeks that added up to their own kind of apology. He started asking me actual technical questions about Spindle, real ones, taking notes on a legal pad the way he used to when I was in college, and he'd sit in on my study sessions just to understand what I was learning. He never said the words "I'm sorry" outright, not in the direct way my mother had, but 2 months later, at another family dinner, when Grant started to say our app out of old habit, my father cut in, gently but clearly, and said, "You mean Reese's app, that you help sell," and something in the way the whole table went quiet for a second, absorbing the correction, told me it had landed exactly the way he intended it to. Odette Reyes called me directly 6 days later, not Grant, a detail I noticed immediately and appreciated more than I probably should have. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "The firm isn't interested in funding the deal as originally pitched, and frankly, I'm not interested in funding a founding team with the kind of internal dysfunction we just witnessed in that room. But I am interested in the product, and I'm interested in you specifically, as its actual builder. If you were to come back to us with a founding structure that accurately reflects who built this company, you as CEO, full stop, whatever role your brother plays or doesn't play clearly defined and appropriately smaller, I'd want to have a real conversation about funding." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest, something that had been braced and defensive for 8 months finally, cautiously, allowing itself to loosen. "I'd need to think about what role, if any, my brother plays going forward," I told her honestly. "That's exactly the right answer," she said. "Take the time you need. But Reese, and I don't say this often, so take it for what it's worth, the 20 minutes you spent explaining your own product in that room was one of the more impressive technical walkthroughs I've heard from a founder this year. Don't let what your brother did make you doubt that. That part was entirely yours, and it was very, very good." I should mention the family group chat, because if you have a large enough extended family, you know that no piece of drama, however private, ever actually stays private for long, and ours is no exception. Somehow, I still don't know exactly how, though I have my suspicions involving my cousin who works 2 cubicles down from someone who knows an associate at Odette's firm. A garbled, second-hand version of the investor meeting made its way into the Doyle family group chat within about 72 hours, arriving in fragments that grew more dramatic with each retelling. By the time my Aunt Carol weighed in, the story had transformed into something involving, as far as I could tell from her message, Reese standing on the conference table and security being called, neither of which had happened, though I'll admit the mental image gave me the first real laugh I'd had in days. My cousin Deb sent a single message that read, in full, "Did Reese really fire Grant in a board meeting?" followed immediately by a laughing emoji, and then, 30 seconds later, a much more serious "Wait, is this real? Are you two okay?" I ended up having to send a single, clarifying message to the entire group chat, 31 people, some of whom I hadn't spoken to directly in over a year, that read, "No table standing occurred. No security was called. Grant and I are figuring things out privately and would appreciate everyone not weighing in with theories. Love you all, please stop." It did approximately nothing to slow the group chat down, and for about a week, I received texts from second cousins I'd met exactly twice in my life, each with their own increasingly baroque theory about what had really happened in that room, a small, absurd reminder that even your worst professional moment eventually becomes, in the hands of extended family, a form of entertainment nobody consulted you about. Tasha found the whole thing hilarious in a way that helped more than she probably realizes. You've officially become a cautionary tale at Doyle family Thanksgivings for the next decade, she told me over the phone, laughing so hard she could barely get the sentence out. Somewhere in Ohio, a 7-year-old cousin you've never met is going to grow up believing you once flipped a conference table. I did not flip a table. I know that. Deb's kids do not know that. That's a much better story, Reese, and frankly I think you should let it live. I have to tell you about Corinne, the laundromat owner from the original pilot, because when she found out what had happened, her reaction did more for my morale during that whole ordeal than almost anything else, and because it's the kind of detail my brother's version of this story would never have thought to include. Corinne had been running her laundromat for 11 years by the time I approached her about the pilot, a blunt, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd agreed to try spindle mostly, she told me later, because you looked like you were about to cry in my parking lot at midnight and I felt bad for you. She'd watched the whole project develop from the very beginning, had given me that crucial early feedback about the wet hands button, had, in her own gruff way, become something like an unofficial mentor over those first months. When I finally told her, months after the investor meeting, what had actually happened, the pitch deck, the erased credit, the whole slow unraveling, she set down the roll of quarters she'd been counting behind her counter and looked at me for a long moment. Men have been taking credit for women's work since before either of us were born, she said. But most of them don't have the decency to get caught doing it in a room full of people whose entire job is catching liars for a living. Sounds like the universe did you a favor, dressed up as a bad afternoon. She insisted, after that, on putting a small sign up near her front counter, hand-lettered in the same style as her old out-of-order signs, that simply read, "Built by Reese Doyle. Fixed by nobody else." I have a photograph of it on my phone that I look at more often than is probably healthy, a small, stubborn monument to the 11 months nobody outside that laundromat had bothered to notice who'd actually done the work. Grant and I didn't speak for almost 3 weeks after that parking garage conversation, the longest stretch of silence between us in either of our adult lives, filled mostly by terse, unavoidable interactions at family gatherings neither of us could skip without causing more disruption than either of us wanted. It was Grant, eventually, who reached out first, which surprised me, a short text asking if we could talk, properly, no family dinner audience, just the two of us. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, and he said something I hadn't expected, something that took him visibly a lot of effort to get out. "I've been telling myself a story for 8 months, he said, staring at his coffee rather than at me. That I was the one making this real. That your part was just the technical labor, and my part was the vision, the business sense, the thing that would actually turn it into a company. I think I needed to believe that, because the alternative, that I was riding on something you built entirely yourself, contributing mostly competence and connections, felt like admitting I hadn't actually built anything of my own at all, not once, not in my entire adult life, and everyone in our family already sort of expected me to be the one who eventually did. It wasn't a perfect apology either, still tangled up in his own insecurities more than fully centered on the harm he'd caused me, but it was, I recognized, an honest one, maybe the most honest thing Grant had said to me in years. "I'm not cutting you out entirely," I told him, after a long pause. "But it's my company. My name at the top, my equity majority, my final say on anything technical or product-related. If you want a role, it's business development, clearly defined, clearly smaller, and it comes with an actual signed agreement this time, not a verbal handshake over pie." "That's fair," he said, and meant it, I think, in a way he hadn't meant anything he'd said to me in the 8 months prior. "That's more than fair, honestly, given everything." There was a long pause after that, both of us stirring coffee we weren't drinking, and then Grant, in a clumsy attempt to lighten the mood that only he could manage at a moment like that, said, "For what it's worth, I really was going to figure out how to explain the tagging algorithm eventually. I had notes somewhere." Grant: "You once told our mother that an API was basically the app's Wi-Fi." That's okay, that's not entirely wrong. Conceptually, it is entirely wrong, Grant. It is wrong in every conceivable way a sentence can be wrong. He actually laughed at that, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from him in weeks, and for a second, underneath all the wreckage of the previous few months, I caught a glimpse of the brother I'd grown up with before any of this happened, before pitch decks and investor coffees and a family gravity that had taught us both, far too young, which of us was supposed to be believed and which of us was supposed to simply do the work quietly in the background. "I'm going to be better at this," he said, once the laughter faded. "The role you're describing. I actually think I'll be good at it, without needing to pretend it's something bigger than what it is." "I think you will too," I told him, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that I meant it. I want to tell you about the version of that meeting that almost happened, the one where I stayed in my seat, because I think it matters as much as the one where I stood. For nearly a full minute after Odette asked her question, I sat frozen in that back row, my own heart pounding, running through every reason not to move. What if I stood up and it looked petty, vindictive, a jealous sister trying to sabotage her brother's big moment? What if Grant turned it around somehow, painted me as difficult, and I lost not just the funding but the relationship too? What if the investors simply didn't believe me, a woman in a borrowed blazer with a guest badge, over a man in a tailored suit who'd clearly rehearsed his confidence for exactly this room? It was, oddly, a memory of the laundromat that got me moving, that same Tuesday night, months earlier, standing in front of broken machines with no one willing to fix them, no one willing to even acknowledge they were broken. I'd built Spindle because I was tired of things staying broken simply because acknowledging the problem felt inconvenient to someone. Watching Grant stand at that podium, presenting a version of reality that was, functionally, its own broken machine with an out-of-order sign nobody wanted to read, I understood, with a clarity that finally overrode the fear, that I hadn't spent 14 months building something real just to let it stay mislabeled because standing up felt uncomfortable. So I stood. Not because I was fearless. Because I decided, in that specific moment, that the discomfort of speaking was smaller than the cost of staying quiet, a calculation I've had to make more than once since, and one I suspect I'll have to keep making for the rest of my career. I went back to Odette Reyes's firm 4 months later, alone this time, no borrowed blazer, no guest badge, my own name at the top of a deck I'd built myself with an actual founder bio slide, my own headshot on it, my own story told in my own words. Grant wasn't in the room. He'd agreed, in the end, that the second pitch should be entirely mine, a decision I think cost him more pride than he let on, though he never once complained about it out loud. The pitch went well, better than well, honestly, because I no longer had to watch someone else fumble a question about my own product, no longer had to sit behind a half-wall of glass wondering whether anyone would ever ask the right question at the right moment. I answered every technical question directly, confidently, because they were, after all, questions about my own work, and by the end of the meeting, Odette Reyes was already talking term sheets. We closed the round 6 weeks later. Spindle now operates in 11 cities, has a small but growing technical team that I hired and lead, and Grant, true to the agreement we eventually signed, with an actual lawyer, actual paperwork, actual equity clearly defined, runs business development, a role he's turned out to be genuinely good at, once it was a real job description instead of a slow, quiet theft of someone else's. I think about that meeting a lot, the glass-walled conference room, the back row, the badge that just said guest, and one investor's single, deceptively simple question that split my entire life into a before and after in the space of about 4 seconds. I've learned, since then, that credit has a way of eventually finding its rightful owner, but only if that owner is willing, at some point, to stand up in the room and say so out loud, however unsteady their legs feel doing it. Nobody was going to do that part for me. Not my brother, not my parents, not even the investor who asked exactly the right question. She only opened the door. Walking through it was always going to have to be mine. I keep Curran's hand-lettered sign photographed on my phone, and I keep the original, and signed founder's agreement in a drawer at my new office, a small, deliberate reminder of exactly how close I came to losing something I'd built with my own 2 hands, one late night at a time, because I was too polite, too used to staying quiet, too well trained by 30 years of family dinners to believe that the person who does the work is always the one who gets to tell the story about it. That's the part one wants you to take from this, more than the funding, more than the 11 cities, more than the tidy, satisfying justice of watching my brother's face freeze in front of a room full of strangers. Doing the work is necessary. It is not, on its own, always sufficient. Somewhere along the way, you also have to be willing to stand up, in your own borrowed blazer, and say the truth out loud, in a room that might not believe you at first. If someone is quietly taking credit for something you built, watch for the moment the room finally asks the right question. And when it comes, however frightened you are, however borrowed your blazer, stand up anyway. Your name belongs on the slide. Say so. Thank you for staying till the end.